know, the situation in the region has changed, I would dare say, quite dramatically since the signature of the nuclear deal between the Iranian regime and the P5+1. This agreement, has been for a very long time a goal, very cherished goal by the Obama administration and also by the European Union, by many European governments, and most particularly by the European External Action Service, which is led by Mrs. Mogherini. So there has been a lot of diplomatic, political effort to make this deal successful. And at the end, after some time of, let's say, progress and failures, at the end the agreement was a reality. And as I say, this initiated a new era in the relations between the regime and the Western powers. After the deal, the new doctrine, let's say, or the new school of thought was that a dialogue, a constructive dialogue, to use the same words as Mrs. Mogherini likes so much, a constructive dialogue could be possible with the regime. And this dialogue could extend to different fields like energy, trade, culture, education, even, this is ironical, human rights. And delegations from different European capitals flew to Iran. Delegations composed by political representatives, ministers, also by important businessmen, to try to establish a framework of cooperation, because it was said that Iran was a big market with a great potential of growth, and there were many opportunities for European companies to work with the Iranians and important business opportunities. Well, unfortunately, this is more an illusion than a reality, because what the regime is doing is to use the nuclear deal in their interest, but no significant progress has been made in all the other aspects of the relation between the regime and the European Union and the United States. The strategy of the regime in the region, at least for some of us, is very clear. They want to be the hegemonic power in the region. They want to control the region. And as part of this strategy, they have used in their benefit an idea of the European External Action Service and many European governments, that the regime could be a partner in the fight against Islamic State. So they say, now that the nuclear deal is signed, we have this dialogue, they can cooperate with us to eradicate, to defeat our worst enemy, which is the jihadism, Islamic State terrorism, that is destroying and reducing to slavery important parts of the territory of Iraq and Syria. Well, this is an illusion, as I say, because for the regime, the fight against ISIS is not a real goal for them. It's just an excuse, a good pretext to be massively present in the region. For instance, in Syria, they have more troops than the Syrian government of Assad himself. And thanks to this massive presence of the Quds force, even the regular army of Iran is there, and also Hezbollah and many Shiite militias controlled and paid by the regime, they can make progress in their final purpose, which is the control of the region, and to reduce Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and other countries to the condition of satellites of the Iranian regime. This, of course, has created great tensions with other powers in the region, specifically the monarchies in the Gulf, which feel logically threatened by this strategy of the Iranian regime. And at the moment, the whole region is in a state of war, of chaos, with a great uncertainty and many risks in the future. About all this, we are going to speak in this session, in this panel, and we have to discuss and to analyze these important issues. A very learned and excellent panel, which are the five gentlemen that I have the pleasure to be with today. We have with us Adam Early, who is the former U.S. ambassador to Bahrain and also former spokesman of the State Department. To my right, I have my very good colleague from many years in the European Parliament, Struan Stevenson. Struan and I, we have been 15 years in the Parliament together and fighting for democratic change in Iran during the 15 years. That has created a great friendship among us, because when you suffer together, you become very good friends, you see. And Struan, among different responsibilities in the Parliament, was the chairman of the delegation of the European Parliament for Iraq. So he's very knowledgeable about this country and its problems. We have also with us Jean-Sylvestre Mongrenier. Jean-Sylvestre, il est chercheur à l'Institut français de géopolitique et membre de l'Institut Thomas More. Je crois que c'est la deuxième fois que j'ai le plaisir d'être avec vous ici.
Tout à fait.
So, merci beaucoup. Then we have Michael Prejean, who is an analyst at the Hudson Institute, specialized in Middle East. And we have to the former Prime Minister of Algeria, Sid Ahmed Ghazali, another very good friend and a great supporter of the Iranian resistance and a long-day fighter for democratic change and freedom in Iran. So, this is the panel. I think we couldn't have a better panel than this. So, we'll start. You can speak, you can make an introduction for, let's say, around 10 minutes. Then, after that, we can discuss among ourselves, and also the floor can make questions. So, I give the floor first to Adam Early.
Well, thank you, sir, and it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you to NCRI and PMOI and all the folks who organize this great event. I think it's important that we all come together once a year to, I don't know, ask the big questions, think the big thoughts, and actually sort of mobilize for action. So I will try to keep my remarks brief in order to be able to have questions, and number one. Number two, what I really want to focus on actually is less theory and more practice, in the sense that I'd like the outcome of this, or I would hope the outcome of this can be sort of a program of action, not just this panel, but the conference, a program of action. So I'm going to speak from the perspective of someone who served on the front lines of the war with Iran. And those front lines include, I guess, three. They include Bahrain, which I like to call the sort of geostrategic fault line, like the San Andreas Fault. It's that crack running north-south that separates east and west. And if there's a shift in that fault line, it has reverberations throughout the region. Bahrain is that fault line. So that's the front line number one. Front line number two, I served in Iraq for many years, particularly during the time that I think General Keane was talking about, when EFPs, explosively formed projectiles, were so lethally used against U.S. forces, and during which time we had almost broken the back of Saeb al-Haq and some of the other more lethal militias, only to have all the bad guys let out of jail after we left. The third front line, frankly, was the podium at the State Department, where I would do live briefings defending U.S. policy. And even though that's in Washington, the reason I call it the front line is because, let's not forget, we're also in an information war with Iran, and they are very, very good at it. Much better than we are, frankly. So what are the lessons learned, if you will, from being on the front line of the war with Iran? Number one, they're incredibly patient, and they're incredibly opportunistic. I think it's a truism to say that they look at events and history in terms of hundreds, if not thousands of years. We in the United States look at it in terms of electoral cycles. And those are two very different timelines that, frankly, I think works to Iran's advantage. So that's one lesson learned. They have different timelines. Lesson learned number two is, different timelines, opportunistic. Number two, and they use time to their advantage. Number two, incredibly asymmetric. Look, these guys are master tacticians. You know that better than I. They recognize that confronting a superpower or superpowers is impossible and doomed to failure. So they fight asymmetrically. In other words, using their weaker forces to tactical advantage. And the exhibit A is Hezbollah, the Iraqi militias, the Houthis. In other words, training and developing and building proxy forces to actually wage war on their behalf and expand their influence and advance their agenda. And then the final lesson learned, frankly, is, it's interesting. I do not dispute the notion that Iran is a hegemonistic and aggressive power. But I think it's also worth pointing out that a lot of Iranian regime, and I should qualify when I say Iranian, I'm really talking about the regime. A lot of regime behavior is based on a sense of being vulnerable and being on the defensive as opposed to the offensive. And you can look at a lot of their actions that seem some to be aggressive as actually defensive. For example, the land bridge. For example, Damascus being more important to them than Baghdad, because they've said if Damascus falls, Tehran falls. For them, the fight for Syria is a fight for the homeland, not a foreign adventure, like many others have described it. So where does that take us? Let me talk a little bit. I'm going to make 2 points and then turn it over to the moderator. Point number one is, having seen this conflict from up close in the Gulf, I'm disappointed and concerned in the sense that when President Trump went to Riyadh, it seemed to many observers that the noose around Khamenei's neck was tightening. The bad old days of Obama had gone. We had a president who recognized the danger that Iran represented to the region and the world and the United States, and that he was determined to work with our Sunni allies to do something about it. That was all true, and that was great. And we were kind of on a roll for just a couple of days until Saudi Arabia and Bahrain and the UAE and Egypt decided that enemy number one was not Iran, but Qatar. What in the world? Are you kidding me? So now the noose that was around Khamenei's neck just got taken off. And, my concern is that that's a situation that is not going to change. That this conflict roiling the GCC is going to be prolonged and expensive and costly for the countries concerned, for the United States, and the winner is going to be the clerical regime in Tehran. They are being let off the hook at just the moment when the tide had turned against them. The third and final point I will make is that notwithstanding all the brave and courageous and sacrifices that many, many people are making outside of Iran to confront Iran, the only way to roll back Iranian influence and presence in the region is not by confronting them in, east of the Euphrates or in the mountains of Taiz or the shores of Hodeidah, but is to take the fight to the homeland. Iran is powerful enough, patient enough, tactically sophisticated enough to be able to repel and outlast any offensive against it outside of Iran. Where they are weakest is inside the borders of Iran. And that is where they must be attacked if we have any hope of rolling back their adventurism outside Iran. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much. Now, I'll give the floor to Sidi Ahmed Ghazali.
Merci Alejo. Je ne peux pas m'empêcher de faire précéder mon exposé sur un nouvel hommage que je tiens à rendre à ces amoureux de la liberté et du droit qui sont incarnés dans la personne d'Alejo et de Struan Stevenson. Et je suis témoin que ces pionniers, et quand je dis pionniers, je pèse mes mots, du soutien à la noble cause du peuple iranien et de la résistance iranienne. Je voudrais commencer par faire un certain nombre de points de repère, simplement pour que l'assistance sache que mon discours ne repose pas sur des théories ou sur quelque chose que j'ai appris à l'école ou bien sur des idées reçues. Je veux me baser simplement sur mon expérience personnelle. Pendant 40 ans, j'ai intimement vécu, non seulement avec la réalité algérienne, mais aussi avec la réalité du Moyen-Orient, et notamment de l'Iran, de l'Irak et de la Syrie et de la péninsule arabique. Le premier point de repère, c'est un souvenir. En mars 1900, m'excuse, je vais prendre le démarrer, voilà. En mars 1975, s'est tenu le seul sommet de l'OPEC, c'est-à-dire les chefs d'État de l'OPEC se sont réunis à Alger en mars 1975. Et j'étais à 3 mètres de la délégation iranienne qui était présidée par le Shah d'Iran. Et j'ai gardé dans ma tête cette parole que je cite entre guillemets, son discours. Il disait « l'Iran sera en 1980, tel que, hein, et nous sommes en 1975, la 4e, peut-être même la 3e puissance militaire et industrielle du monde. » Industrielle du monde. Cela me rappelle, quelques années plus tard, ce que les Américains d'ailleurs, l'idée qu'ils ont circulée à travers le monde que l'Irak disposait de la 4e puissance militaire du monde. Et croyez-moi, dans l'esprit dans un cas comme dans l'autre, les dictateurs qui commencent par des fantasmes finissent par croire dans leurs fantasmes. Saddam Hussein croyait en son fantasme. Croyait quand il déclarait à la télévision en 1990, mes ingénieurs ont trouvé des produits chimiques et l'association de ces deux produits nous permettra d'éradiquer Israël en 2 minutes. Et je suis sûr que le Shah, pourquoi je cite le Shah? Parce que l'expansionnisme iranien, et là je note en parenthèse que les régimes iraniens, les régimes dictatoriaux, sont dans une situation d'imposture totale quand ils laissent confondre leur propre régime avec la civilisation perse, qui est autre chose que le régime iranien. Troisième point de repère, c'est que j'ai vécu, j'ai coopéré, travaillé au sein du gouvernement algérien avec le gouvernement iranien, que ce soit du temps du Shah ou du temps de la République islamique. Et Dieu sait si l'Algérie a été amicale et fraternelle avec le régime islamique. C'était le seul pays arabe qui n'a pas participé, qui ne s'est pas mis du côté des Arabes contre l'Iran dans la guerre de 1980. Eh bien, l'Iran, le régime islamique, a soutenu moralement, politiquement et matériellement le terrorisme en Algérie. Vous savez que l'Algérie a vécu une période, ce qu'on appelle la période noire, en 1990, où elle a connu toutes les affres dont on parle maintenant de Daesh. L'Algérie les a vécues il y a déjà 25 ans, et pendant 8 ans. Et en tant que ministre des Affaires étrangères, j'ai dialogué avec Velayati, qui est actuellement était ministre des Affaires étrangères à l'époque et qui est devenu un personnage important, où l'Iran prétendait, disons, s'étendre ou étendre son hégémonie en Algérie. Et j'étais chef du gouvernement sous feu le président Boudiaf quand il a rompu les relations diplomatiques avec l'Iran en 1992, parce que le régime iranien soutenait le terrorisme en Algérie. Et ça, on a tendance à l'oublier. Et enfin, cette histoire de croyance en une sorte d'alliance entre le monde occidental et le régime iranien procède soit de la naïveté, soit d'une hypocrisie totale. On veut faire croire aux gens que ce qui se passe au Moyen-Orient, c'est une affaire entre chiites et sunnites. Mais c'est totalement faux. Sur le plan dogmatique, la différence entre la Shia et la Sunna, c'est une feuille de papier. C'est le même Coran, c'est le même prophète. Et la preuve que ce n'est pas une affaire entre chiites et sunnites, c'est que depuis des années, qui tue le plus de chiites, c'est un régime chiite, c'est le régime iranien. Et Daesh, qu'on impute ou qui se revendique de rite sunnite, Daesh massacre beaucoup plus des sunnites que des chiites. Seulement, on oublie, ou les Occidentaux oublient, que le chiite ou le chiisme n'intéresse pas le régime iranien par amour du chiisme, c'est parce qu'il est instrumenté comme un vecteur d'expansionnisme vis-à-vis ou de domination vis-à-vis de toute la population musulmane à travers le monde. Alors, je suis absolument d'accord avec l'idée développée, en tout cas évoquée, par le sénateur Lieberman, à qui je rends hommage, quand il dit que la menace contre la paix sur la planète vient du gouvernement iranien. Actuel. Et que l'hégémonisme du régime islamique iranien n'est que la continuation de la politique d'une autre dictature, qui était celle du Shah. Maintenant que toutes les informations sont déclassifiées en ce qui concerne le Shah, tous les politologues, les chercheurs scientifiques américains reconnaissent que, contrairement aux vœux d'Eisenhower et de Truman, qui ne voulaient pas s'ingérer en tant que président des États-Unis dans les affaires irano-iraniennes, c'est la CIA qui, en 1951, a organisé de bout en bout la chute du docteur Mossadegh, qui était issu de choix populaires à la tête du gouvernement iranien. Et donc, ce qui me fait dire, en allant, disons, plus profondément que le sénateur Lieberman, je dis que la problématique iranienne est une question centrale. C'est une question centrale. Et je ne le dis pas vraiment avec la volonté d'exagérer, et pour trois raisons. La première, c'est que nous avons affaire, avec le gouvernement iranien, à une dictature religieuse cruelle qui manque totalement de fiabilité sur le plan disons, on ne peut pas faire confiance à une dictature de ce type qui ne fait qu'instrumenter l'islam à des fins purement politiciennes, des fins de pouvoir. De la même manière que Saddam Hussein disait, après avoir envahi le Koweït, j'ai envahi le Koweït pour libérer la Palestine. De la même manière, Ahmadinejad est venu quelques années plus tard prétendre qu'il veut la bombe atomique pour éradiquer Israël. Parce qu'il pense qu'aux yeux des masses musulmanes, c'est quelque chose qui rapporte beaucoup. De se présenter aux masses arabes et musulmanes comme étant les défenseurs des musulmans et des Palestiniens. Voilà. Je ne sais pas si j'ai dépassé le temps. Tu me dis, Alejo.
Oui,
d'après mes trucs, il me reste encore 9 minutes. Je ne sais pas, non? C'est trop? Bon. Si c'est trop, il faut me le dire, je coupe. Moi, je suis très discipliné. Donc, je dis que la question est centrale parce que nous avons affaire à un régime dont l'objectif réel demeure de prendre le commandement, le califat sur tous les musulmans. C'est un objectif qui est politique. Et qu'est-ce qu'ils utilisent comme moyen? Chaque État utilise les moyens qu'il a pour peser sur les décisions du monde. Eh bien, la stratégie du gouvernement iranien, c'est d'utiliser leur capacité de nuisance. C'est-à-dire, ils veulent s'imposer comme un interlocuteur, disons, régional privilégié en montrant leur capacité de nuisance. Le sénateur Lieberman s'est interrogé, dit pourquoi ils construisent des fusées balistiques, etc. Pour moi, la réponse est simple. C'est pour impressionner les masses arabes et impressionner l'Occident pour dire nous sommes capables de vous nuire, donc vous devez nous reconnaître comme interlocuteur. La deuxième raison qui fait que c'est une question centrale, de l'autre côté, à l'opposé d'un régime iranien cruel, dictateur et régime théocratique, il y a la résistance iranienne, qui n'est pas née de la dernière pluie, qui, comme j'ai dit tout à l'heure, est venue dans le sillage spirituel du docteur Mossadegh, et qui, depuis 50 ans, se bat pour que le peuple iranien reprenne, disons, sa souveraineté sur son propre destin. Eh bien, ce que fait la résistance iranienne, c'est-à-dire ces sacrifices énormes, 120 000 opposants iraniens ont été massacrés par le régime de Wilayat al-Faqih, de Khamenei et Khomeini. Eh bien, ce n'est pas uniquement, en tout cas sur le plan des effets, c'est toute la communauté musulmane qui est en train de tirer bénéfice des résultats dont je ne fais pas de doute pour demain. Et qui va détruire la présidente du mouvement du Conseil national, la sœur Maryam Rajavi, a toujours dit nous excluons aussi bien le recours à la guerre contre l'Iran, qui ne fera que renforcer le régime iranien en le présentant comme une victime, comme nous refutons toute croyance au fait qu'une négociation avec le régime iranien est crédible. Et elle a toujours parlé de la troisième voie. La troisième voie, c'est que ce régime ne peut pas tomber que par la force du peuple iranien et par ses représentants. Et enfin, on a parlé de la bombe atomique. Moi, je ne crois pas que l'Iran cherche à détenir la bombe atomique, parce que l'usage de la bombe atomique, c'est quelque chose qui est suicidaire. Par contre, ils ont acquis la technologie pour fabriquer la bombe sale. C'est-à-dire, ce n'est pas la bombe atomique, mais c'est la bombe qui fait beaucoup de mal, hein, et qui ne nécessite pas une réaction nucléaire. Voilà, le but, c'est augmenter la capacité de nuisance de... Alors, il y a là donc un travail formidable à faire auprès des opinions musulmanes. Et il faut décrasser les esprits des opinions occidentales. Il faut leur enlever de la tête toutes ces idées reçues, à savoir des idées qui consistent à... Et ne pas oublier, on a beau être les États-Unis d'Amérique, avec la puissance, etc., on peut se tromper. Et l'expérience nous montre que très souvent l'administration américaine a commis des actes qui sont violemment contraires à ses propres intérêts. Ne serait-ce que la guerre contre l'Irak, par exemple. La guerre contre l'Irak en 2003, est-ce que les résultats ont bénéficié au peuple américain ou à la nation américaine? Certainement pas. Et est-ce qu'elles ont bénéficié aux populations locales? Il y a eu des millions de morts. Et on a transformé cette région, qui était indemne de toute action terroriste, par exemple, en un immense réservoir. Et on peut très bien se tromper, comme ils l'ont été en Afghanistan. Ben Laden qu'ils ont combattu. Ça n'empêche pas que Ben Laden a travaillé pour eux d'abord, sur la base d'une erreur qui consistait à dire, par les Américains, l'ennemi de notre ennemi, quand il y avait les Soviétiques, c'est notre ami. Eh bien, ils se sont aperçus que ce théorème ou ce postulat est faux. Alors, donc, on peut se tromper, en plus, il y a beaucoup de cas où les Américains et ça les Européens ne devraient jamais l'oublier, peuvent commettre des erreurs monumentales qui vont même contre leurs propres intérêts. Et évidemment, elles vont contre nos intérêts, puisque nous, dans le monde, disons, émergent, nous payons une double facture. Nous payons la facture de nos propres turpitudes, de nos propres insuffisances, mais nous payons la facture des erreurs que commettent les Occidentaux sur l'évaluation de leurs propres intérêts. Voilà, mon cher Alejo, je crois que j'ai abusé de ta gentillesse, mais enfin...
Pas du tout, parce que tout ce que tu as dit est très intéressant. Pourtant, merci beaucoup. I think that after listening to our first two speakers, there are some points that I think are extremely relevant, that we have listened from different perspectives to both of them. Because Ambassador Early has reminded us something that is crucial and that we forget, is that the Iranian regime measures time by centuries, and we measure it by years. And the proof is what our friend Ahmed Ghazali said, that 25 years ago, they were already sponsoring terrorism in Algeria. So it's a constant, you see? So exactly the same. Even if, as he recalled us, Algeria was, in that moment, supportive of the regime. But they don't care about this, because their line of action that extends very long term is always the same. And the second point that also we heard from both of them is that where they are weak is in Iran, in the homeland. And that's why they always promote conflict outside Iran. And what Ambassador Early said is extremely insightful. A pity Mrs. Mogherini could not attend this seminar. He said the regime taking war and conflict far from beyond its borders, what it's doing, in fact, is defending itself. This is a crucial point. And if we understand these things, then we are in a better position to neutralize the threat that the regime represents. Unfortunately, not the former American administration, the present one, we will see what happens because it's still unknown, but the former present administration and also the European Union obviously did not understand these elementary points that Ambassador Early and former Prime Minister Ghazali have just reminded us. Good. Now we go on, and I give the floor to our good friend Mogherini.
Merci. Sorry, I'm going to speak French. It will be easier for me. Oui, donc beaucoup de choses ont déjà été dites. Je vais m'efforcer de ne pas répéter ce qui a été déjà vu précédemment. L'idée force de cette intervention, c'est qu'il est urgent de tracer une ligne dans le sable. On sait que c'est une référence donc à peine implicite à un ouvrage récent sur les accords Sykes-Picot, et puis plus généralement donc sur ces espaces, sur ce théâtre syro-irakien, où effectivement de 1916 à 1920, puisque tout ne s'est pas joué avec les accords Sykes-Picot, on a eu une longue négociation, notamment entre Français et Britanniques, pour départager, si je puis dire, le mandat français sur la Syrie et le mandat britannique sur l'Irak. Et ce sont ces frontières qui ont volé en éclats de manière évidente en 2014 lorsque l'État islamique a surgi. Alors la situation sur le terrain, on la connaît tous, je n'entre pas dans le détail. Ce qui me semble important, c'est qu'elle démontre la réalité d'une stratégie iranienne, en tout cas du régime iranien. C'est celle du croissant chiite. L'expression donc est apparue dans les années 2000. À l'époque, souvent, elle était présentée comme une construction idéologique qui était plaquée sur une réalité régionale beaucoup plus complexe. Alors c'est vrai que les choses sont complexes, mais il faut se référer parfois à Guillaume d'Occam, au principe de parcimonie, essayer de mettre en évidence l'essentiel. Et le fait est qu'il y a une stratégie de longue haleine. On peut reprocher beaucoup de choses à ce régime, mais on ne peut certainement pas lui reprocher de ne pas avoir de stratégie. Et cette stratégie, c'est l'expression d'une vision du monde. En allemand, on parlerait de Weltanschauung, une vision du monde qui est assez complète, finalement, qui est construite. Alors, quelle est la part du schisme dans cette affaire ? Là aussi, c'est une question complexe. C'est un petit peu une histoire de poule et d'œuf. C'est-à-dire qu'on a une dialectique entre, d'un côté, des ambitions de politique pure, des ambitions de puissance, de pouvoir, et puis le fait est que le schisme a joué quand même un rôle important dans la genèse de l'identité iranienne, et c'est à la source d'un certain nombre de mobiles, d'un certain nombre de motivations. Et le fait est que c'est instrumentalisé sur la scène extérieure, mais je me méfie un petit peu de la vision trop machiavélienne, machiavélique. Finalement, ça serait uniquement des gens de pouvoir qui ne croiraient en rien et puis qui agiraient uniquement dans une logique de pouvoir. Ils ont de véritables motivations autrement plus profondes. Donc voilà pour ces quelques mots sur la stratégie qui est mise en œuvre, avec quand même insistante sur le fait que l'Iran, le régime iranien réduit à ses seuls moyens, n'a pas véritablement la capacité de mener cette stratégie, et c'est en étroite alliance avec la Russie que cette stratégie aujourd'hui remporte un certain nombre de succès sur le terrain. J'y reviendrai après. Alors face à cette stratégie, on a donc un tournant qui est amorcé, semble-t-il, avec la nouvelle administration américaine. On sait que pour l'administration Obama, ce qui était la priorité, c'était cet accord sur le nucléaire iranien. Et à partir de là, on était prêt à fermer les yeux sur un certain nombre d'agissements. Cela dit, je pense que ça n'était pas uniquement de l'hypocrisie. Il y avait véritablement, semble-t-il, la croyance dans la possibilité d'une transformation en douceur de ce régime, un petit peu sur le modèle Gorbatchev, sans prendre en compte le fait que Gorbatchev, s'il voulait être le rénovateur du socialisme, du communisme, a historiquement été le fossoyeur. Du communisme, mais il y avait cette idée finalement selon laquelle il pourrait y avoir une évolution à partir d'une logique des intérêts bien compris. Et à mon sens, ça renvoie à une faiblesse de l'Occident. Le fait est que notre philosophie de l'histoire aujourd'hui est assez pauvre. Ça tient en une sorte de millénarisme de l'ordinateur, une sorte de militarisme de faible intensité fondé sur Internet et les réseaux sociaux. On se persuade tous que finalement tout le monde dans le monde voudrait en dernière instance uniquement accéder à un certain stade de consommation et pouvoir donc atteindre un bonheur privé, alors que le fait est que ce n'est pas la seule clé de l'histoire universelle. Alors ça concerne certainement pas uniquement l'administration Obama, ni même les États-Unis. On trouve ce type de faiblesse dans l'ensemble de pays occidentaux. Le fait est qu'il y a un déficit de métaphysique, si je puis dire, dans la civilisation occidentale postmoderne. Bon, toujours est-il qu'avec cette administration Trump, cette nouvelle administration, il semble y avoir une prise de conscience. On l'observe sur le terrain. La question, c'est de savoir si ça va déboucher sur une véritable stratégie inscrite dans la durée. Il me semble qu'il n'y a pas encore de véritable vision américaine sur l'avenir de la Syrie, sur l'avenir de la région en général. Et puis, il y a aussi la question des forces sur le terrain. Le fait est que cette stratégie, aujourd'hui, sur un plan tactique, elle repose quand même très largement sur ce que l'on appelle des forces par procuration, des proxies en anglais. Je ne sais pas jusqu'où cette stratégie peut faire l'économie de déploiements militaires plus importants, d'un engagement militaire plus important. Et donc, je rejoins ici, dans une certaine mesure, ce qui a été dit par l'un de mes prédécesseurs. Alors, en troisième point, j'attirerai l'attention sur le sud-est syrien, sur ce grand désert syrien, où il se passe un certain nombre de choses, notamment autour d'Al-Tanaf, qui peut être le catalyseur d'un conflit plus large. Alors Al-Tanaf, je ne peux pas m'appuyer sur une carte ici, c'est un poste isolé en plein désert. Si on regarde les choses de loin, les enjeux semblent microscopiques. Dans la réalité, c'est un verrou dans ce triangle frontalier entre la Syrie, la Jordanie, l'Irak. On a ici un carrefour stratégique. C'est un point d'appui qui est utilisé par les États-Unis, les Britanniques aussi, semble-t-il, dans une certaine mesure, pour former les rebelles syriens, un certain nombre de groupes, et puis conduire donc à des opérations dans l'est de la Syrie. Et on sait qu'au cours des mois de mai, de juin, eh bien, on a eu un certain nombre d'incidents dans cette région. Il y a une volonté claire de la part de Damas et de ses alliés, mais je devrais plutôt dire ses parrains, notamment le parrain iranien, de reprendre le contrôle de l'est syrien. Et puis inversement, eh bien, il y a la volonté américaine de tracer justement une ligne dans le sable et puis de casser, d'interrompre ce que l'on appelle parfois le corridor chiite. Finalement, l'Iran a réussi à ouvrir une voie au nord vers Beyrouth et vers Tartous, pardon, et puis voudrait également donc ouvrir une voie terrestre continue au sud vers Beyrouth. Et donc, il y a des enjeux qui ne sont pas simplement tactiques, qui ont une portée stratégique au-delà géopolitique, qui se jouent autour d'Al-Tanaf. C'est le fameux Land Bridge dont on a parlé à plusieurs reprises. Alors, au-delà, ou plutôt en toile de fond de cette opposition américano-iranienne autour d'Al-Tanaf, il y a cette idée, il y a cette vision selon laquelle on pourrait peut-être progresser vers un Yalta syrien, c'est-à-dire finalement la Russie contrôlerait à l'ouest de la Syrie, ce qu'on appelle parfois la Syrie utile, donc sur la base d'ambitions avant tout, d'intérêts avant tout géostratégiques, Tartous, Latakia, etc. Et puis finalement, on pourrait trouver un terrain d'accord avec les Russes pour que l'est de la Syrie soit contrôlé par les États-Unis et leurs alliés locaux. Pour ma part, je suis assez dubitatif parce que je pense qu'entre la Russie et l'Iran, il y a une véritable alliance sur le terrain et au-delà. Finalement, il y a quand même une grande proximité dans les stratégies et dans les conceptions géopolitiques de ce deux pays. Il y a notamment le caractère révisionniste de leur programme géopolitique et il y a la volonté de battre en brèche l'hégémonie américano-occidentale sur le Moyen-Orient qui, de fait, a été quand même passablement bousculée ces dernières années. Et donc, là encore, il ne faut certainement pas céder à une vision un petit peu trop économique, en quelque sorte, une version stratégique, géopolitique de l'homo economicus. Tout se déciderait à partir d'un simple calcul d'intérêt et les Russes auraient donc intérêt, finalement, à passer, au moins implicitement, un Yalta syrien avec les États-Unis. Les passions, au sens Spinozi, si vous voulez, les passions tristes, la volonté de revanche, le ressentiment, ça joue un rôle important dans la politique et plus largement dans l'histoire mondiale. Et la Russie a des conceptions, a des ambitions qui vont au-delà de simplement reprendre pied dans une partie du Proche-Orient. Alors pour finir mon propos, j'insisterai sur la question du régime qui a été notamment abordée lors de la table ronde précédente. C'est vrai qu'en tout cas, vu d'Europe, souvent c'est vu comme quelque chose de secondaire. Et puis on insiste sur la nécessité d'éviter les erreurs qui ont pu être commises en Irak. Mais à mon sens, ça c'est une question qui est quand même incontournable. Il faut bien se rappeler que les espaces géographiques, les pays n'agissent pas par eux-mêmes. Quand on dit l'Iran, les États-Unis, la France, l'Europe, ce sont des métaphores spatiales, ce que l'on appelle des géographismes. Concrètement, ce sont des hommes qui agissent, ce sont des forces politiques avec leur vision des choses. On a des systèmes de pouvoir, bref, tout ce qui fait un régime. Et le fait est que ce régime, par sa nature même, par son ADN, s'inscrit dans une logique d'expansion, d'expression finalement d'une volonté de puissance. Et puis alors maintenant, si on regarde l'histoire, le fait est que bien souvent, le changement de régime est le point de passage obligé ou la conséquence inéluctable dans la conclusion, si je puis dire, d'un conflit géopolitique, que cela nous plaise ou pas. Merci.
Merci beaucoup, Jean-Sylvestre. C'était aussi très intéressant. Et, and I would like to underline something you said. It is the real nature of this regime prevents the regime to evolve. This is another crucial point. Because sometimes when we listen to these people in the External Action Service, they say, no, we must engage because we must support the moderates because they will evolve. No, I mean, it's impossible. The kind of regime that is the Islamic Republic of Iran, and we have seen similar regimes in history, is such that if they evolve positively towards a more open or more democratic or more human regime, they disappear. So it's impossible. They cannot. So this was another point that it's important to have in mind, that to hope that the regime will evolve, it's nonsense because it can't evolve. And now I'll give the floor to Michael Prejeant. Please,
Thank you.
Michael.
Thanks for having me. Well, before becoming a Middle East analyst for the Hudson Institute, I was an intelligence officer for 28 years, focusing on the Middle East. And I just want to go through 3 time periods just to show you how the Revolutionary Guard can be impacted, can lose leverage, can lose strength, and can gain strength when not paid attention to. They can lose strength again. So in 2007, at the height of the surge, I worked for General McMaster and General Petraeus, and our main focus was to look at the level of Iranian influence in the security and the intelligence ministries. And what we found was there was a lot of influence, and it was through the use of proxies, it was through the use of Badr Corps. And the one thing we learned was, if you wear a suit and a tie and you have a British accent, Americans will listen to you. we got to get away from that. So Badr Corps presented themselves, we wear ties, we wear suits, we're just like you. And the Badr Corps was the IRGC's premier proxy in Iraq. But it wasn't good enough. So after Badr Corps was positioned, Muqtada al-Sadr started pushing back against the Revolutionary Guard and Qasem Soleimani. Qasem Soleimani brought him to Iran and put him in his corner for a little while, and then started identifying the talent within Jaish al-Mahdi into Muqtada al-Sadr's group. And he found Qais Khazali, he found Laith Khazali. And the reason I mentioned those 2 individuals is in 2007, the United States received intelligence, solid intelligence, that Qasem Soleimani ordered the kidnapping of 4 Americans to trade for the Erbil 4. And the Erbil 4 were 4 IRGC operatives that were captured by Joint Special Operations Command. This operation went wrong. 5 Americans died, 4 were executed, 1 died trying to save the others. But it led to the arrest of Qais Khazali, Laith Khazali, and Lebanese Hezbollah operator Dakduk. So in 2007, we have Baghdadi in prison in Buqa. We have Qais Khazali in prison, Laith Khazali and Dakduk. We have the Sunni awakening helping us decimate al-Qaeda. We are securing Baghdad and Iraq to the point where in 2006 there were 56 attacks a day, and in 2007, 2008, literally 12 unsuccessful attacks a month, which was a big deal. We finally had leverage with the Kurds, with the Shia, and with the Sunnis in Iraq. And we were able to get in there, and that was the focus. General Petraeus took President Obama on a tour of the battlefield. And in that tour, a message was sent. It may not have been intentional, but Qasem Soleimani was listening. And that message was, I don't care if the surge is working, we are out of here. So we talk about the strategic patience of the IRGC, of the Revolutionary Guard and its Quds Force, of Qasem Soleimani. What he heard then was, wait. The Americans are leaving. 2008, 2009, we still were targeting Kitab Hezbollah. We were still targeting Asab al-Haq after they broke ceasefires. And Jaish al-Mahdi was marginalized. 2010, Qasem Soleimani put pressure on Shia political parties to make sure that they kept Prime Minister Maliki in power. Prime Minister Maliki used the threat of ISIS, or Al-Qaeda at the time, now ISIS, a similar tactic we see being used by leaders in Syria and Iraq. The threat of ISIS allows Iran to stay. He also declared martial law, and he actually used the IRGC to intimidate Shia political leaders that were looking to vote for Iyad Alawi. And in 2010, another message was sent, hands off. And that message came from the White House. I was in the room with about 20 other people when General Odierno said, "We've been told to take our hands off." And what that meant was, at that time, is that, so in 2010 when that message was sent, by 2011, the Sons of Iraq had been dismantled, a 90,000 strong security initiative that was in place to defeat Al-Qaeda, but not only defeat Al-Qaeda, but to prevent sectarian atrocities in Sunni neighborhoods along the sectarian fault lines of Baghdad, Diyala, Salahuddin, and these other places. All the places now where you see ISIS, 2014, there were 90,000 Sunni cleared and vetted security personnel in a static position, getting paid by their government, getting paid by the Maliki government, though reluctantly, and being empowered by us, meaning if they called us on the radio, we'd show up in 10 minutes. In 2011, those 90,000 were now being targeted, they weren't being given jobs, and they were basically told, you don't have a place in your country, but we're going to erect a statue in Baghdad crediting you with what you did during the surge. So if you look at the footprint of the Sons of Iraq and the awakening in Iraq, and you look at ISIS 2014, it's the same footprint. But it's not 90,000 strong. It was only 30,000 strong. So a lot of the narrative on the other side, and this was also an Iranian narrative, an IRGC narrative, was that all of the Sunnis that were part of the Sons of Iraq were just Al-Qaeda and Sunni insurgents that we simply bought off. Yes, you change minds. You take people off the battlefield, you reconcile with them. I worked with General Lamb as part of an effort, and his message was, you either reconcile with us or we'll put you in the ground. And that was a very effective message when you're dealing with Sunni insurgent leaders, and it worked. So 2007, you saw some success, IRGC marginalized. 2010, the strategic patience pays off. So we fast forward to present, the JCPOA, the Iran deal, like you talked about. The Iran deal, I focused on the non-nuclear concessions made to Iran as part of the JCPOA, the Iran deal. I had a veterans group of former intelligence officers, former military, former hostages from the U.S. Embassy raid in 1979 during the revolution. And we basically focused on the non-nuclear concessions. And what you saw there was Qasem Soleimani comes off sanctions relief. Mohammad Reza Naqvi, the commander of the Basij, comes off sanctions. Banks that supported terrorism, banks directly supporting designated terrorist organizations in Iraq, and to include Hezbollah and other groups, coming off sanctions. So basically the Iran deal re-energized or remobilized Iran's logistical and operational network to support terrorism. And then you saw Qasem Soleimani go to Moscow. Then you saw Russia enter into Syria and change the whole dynamic. Assad was losing at that point. The IRGC was celebrating victories in Iraq. You had Qasem Soleimani in 2007 was a ghost story. Sunnis in cafes would talk about Qasem Soleimani, but in 2014, he was actually walking the streets of Tikrit. He was actually in Baghdad. His lieutenants were sitting across from US generals. So the biggest win at this point, if we go fast forward to this administration, is this administration called Iran's bluff. And what I mean by that, in order to secure the Iran deal, President Obama and his administration had to make a lot of concessions. And I believe those concessions started back in 2009 when we started releasing people like Laith Khazali, Keith Khazali, Doc Duke in 2011. And anybody the Iranians asked for, we started releasing, even though we voted no. We said these guys will return to violence, return to terrorism. So we look at 2015, the Iran deal is going to pass the US Congress. And you see the IRGC empowered. You see them increase their operations in Yemen with their support to the Houthis. You see them increase their operations in Iraq. You see them start creating new Shia militias and deploying them to Syria. recruiting Afghans, Shia Afghans from Afghanistan, and deploying them to Syria, being able to move pieces around the battlefield, and with a budget that was increased because of the Iran deal, the argument was, well, the Saudis spend 10 times more than the Iranians do on defense. The Iranians, the IRGC in particular, is very focused on what it spends its money on. It pays $50 million a year to Kata'ib Hezbollah, $50 million a year to Asab al-Haq, and $200 million a year to Hezbollah. Well, that's 2 F-15s. So what's more effective, Hezbollah, Kata'ib Hezbollah, AAH, or 2 F-15s? We all know the answer to that. So they're very, very strategic. But the good thing about this administration, and I worked for McMaster, I worked for Mattis. Mattis would go to bed saying, I think about 3 things: Iran, Iran, and Iran. And he was talking about the IRGC. He was talking about the Quds Force. Iran's influence in Iraq quickly became the most destabilizing force in Iraq, more so than al-Qaeda and the Sunni insurgency. What we see prior to this administration coming in was Iran big time empowered in Iraq, doing this in Syria, but now we've called their bluff. The Obama administration believed that if we increase sanctions on its ballistic missiles, on its export of terrorism, Iran would walk away from the Iran deal. This administration has called that bluff. We've increased sanctions. When I say we've been pushing, we pushed for the Obama administration to do this. Now this administration is actually doing it, increasing sanctions on Iran for its support of terrorism, ballistic missiles, and Iran hasn't walked away. What we've learned is that Iran needs this Iran deal, so we actually have leverage now. But more importantly, we can still keep tabs on the nuclear aspect of this, and the NCRI has done a great job on educating the U.S. intelligence community on Iran's capabilities and what they're doing. The Obama administration ignored all the intelligence they didn't want to see, and what we've been able to see from the NCRI with these locations, with activity that's not supposed to be going on at these nuclear sites, it's a re-energized effort to look at the Iran deal, to do a complete relook, and to see if we can get this right, while at the same time adding sanctions on their ballistic missile program, on their support for terrorism. And I think there's a schism taking place. I know we talked about this strong alliance between Russia and Iran in Syria. I think Assad and the Iranians are starting to ask Putin, what are you doing here? You can't even protect our airfield from US cruise missiles. They shot down one of our aircraft, and now when Qasem Soleimani deploys Iraqi militias to Al-Tanaf, you can't stop that either. The US is actually hitting IRGC-deployed Iraqi Shia militias as they move towards this strategic place. It's the land bridge that Iran wants between Tehran, Baghdad, and into Damascus. So we're showing that if you just simply call their bluff, they're daif jiddan, they're actually very weak, they're vulnerable, they're schisms we can exploit. And Qasem Soleimani is not having the success that he had in the past. He's not parading around Ramadi, he didn't get a chance to parade around Fallujah, and he's not being part of the Mosul operation. So there is an opportunity here if we actually pay attention to what their capabilities are and what their limitations are, and actually exploit those schisms, those seams. And again, like every panelist has said here, Iran's not in Iraq to fix Iraq or to kill ISIS. Iran is in Iraq to stay. And the same thing with Syria. And they can count on the US to want to fix everything in Iraq and to fix everything in Syria. And we can't do that. So again, your strategic enemy outlasts your US view of time. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Michael. Yes, while you were talking, it came to my mind that sometimes we do exactly the opposite as we should do.
And we get credit for that. When we do
Because
the opposite, they actually think it's brilliant.
The Iranian regime is using, for their benefit, very astuciously and very skillfully, other people, other forces, their proxies. And what we have been doing with the Iranian resistance, that, as it has been said, could be an essential tool to stop the Iranian regime, we blacklisted them. So we shoot in our, it was a shoot in our foot. No? Okay, now our last speaker, Struan Stevenson.
Thank you very much, Alejo. You know, the horrific terrorist attacks that have taken place in Manchester and in London, I think they show clearly to us that the threat of Islamic fundamentalist terrorism is not a threat only in the Middle East, it's a threat to us here in Europe. It's a threat to North America. But I think we have to roll back the clock to look at the genesis of this threat. Who is the godfather of Islamic fundamentalism? Well, it was the 1979 revolution in Iran. It was when Ruhollah Khomeini came to power with a constitution that calls for the export of the revolution and the creation of a caliphate. Funnily enough, the same caliphate that Daesh seek to establish. So, you know, it's interesting when we look at the situation now in the Middle East, where we've heard from the previous panel and everyone in this panel, Iran is behind every conflict in the Middle East. They have sponsored and trained and led the brutal Shia militias in Iraq. They're backing Hezbollah, the Houthi rebels in Yemen, and they're the ones responsible with Putin for keeping the bloody civil war going in Syria with Bashar al-Assad, a murderous dictator at the helm, for 6 years now, nearly 7 years. Hundreds of thousands of innocent people killed. And the fingerprints of the mullahs are across the whole Middle East. Now, we used to look to Iraq as the bulwark against Iranian aggressive expansion. But in fact, very cleverly, I think, as the ambassador said, because they are a very smart regime, the Iranians have gradually infiltrated and taken on a huge influence in Iraq. They ensured that Nouri al-Maliki became the prime minister when in fact he never won the first election. They ensured he became their puppet. They constantly were pressurizing him from Tehran, get rid of all the Sunnis in your cabinet. And first of all, he accused his vice president, Tariq al-Hashemi, the most senior elected Sunni in the country, of terrorist offenses, arrested 12 of his bodyguards. And Amnesty International said one of them, when his body was returned to his parents, they couldn't recognize him because of the torture he had suffered. And based on the confessions under torture, accused Hashemi of terrorist offenses. He fled. Now he's in Turkey. And he's been sentenced to death in absentia 5 times. I think he's in the Guinness Book of Records. And then he tried to arrest his finance minister, also a Sunni. And he started imposing his oppression on the Sunni communities in Al-Anbar province and around the whole of Iraq, and created a civil war which resulted in sucking in Daesh from Syria, who last year, 2 years ago, seized a third of the territory of the whole of Iraq. And then out of the blue, we have the Iranian regime with Qasem Soleimani that we've been hearing about, the head terrorist in the world. We have the Iranian regime saying, we will come to the rescue. We will become your ally in getting rid of Daesh, who are a threat to all of us here in the Middle East. And they have exploited the Daesh crisis to introduce their own genocidal campaign against the Sunnis in Iraq,
wiping out hundreds of thousands of Sunnis and reducing to rubble some of the ancient cities like Fallujah, Ramadi, Tikrit, and now Mosul. Hundreds of thousands of Sunni men are disappearing. Smoking rubble is left behind. And we in the West think that they are our allies, and the Americans, I have to say, have agreed to provide air support to help them in this process. They're going to achieve in Nineveh province, in Al-Anbar province, what they have sought to do all along is to wipe out the Sunni population so that they can ultimately take control of the whole of Iraq. And they're doing this in the name of being allies of the West. It's incredible we have fallen for this. You know, we had 8 years of appeasement policy from the White House. And in the European Parliament, we had the absolutely dreadful head of security, Baroness Ashton. And if Obama said, jump, Ashton used to say, how high? We've got to see a change to this policy, although there is no indication of it happening yet with Mogherini. But you know, I have a theory. When the Soviet Union was at its height, communists around the world were split into dozens of different factions. You had the Trotskyists, the Leninists, the Marxists, the Maoists. They all hated each other. They all fought like cats in a sack. But they all looked to Moscow as the godfather of international communism. The same, I believe, is happening with fundamentalist Islam. You have Daesh, Taliban, Al-Qaeda, Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram, Hezbollah. They all have difficulties with each other, yet we categorize it in the West as a Sunni-Shia conflict. It is not. All of these different factions who also fight like cats in a sack, they look to Tehran as the godfather of international Islamic fundamentalism. And in the same way, when the Soviet Union collapsed, we saw communism fade away. There are a few pockets left, like North Korea, Cuba, perhaps Venezuela, but it has almost faded from the international picture. And if we achieve regime change in Iran, I believe the same fate will occur to fundamentalist Islam. I think it will slide off the international agenda. But we started with the ambassador saying, let's come with some positive suggestions from this conference. Well, I have a couple of positive suggestions for Mr. Trump. You know, he doesn't need to tear up the dreadful nuclear agreement. If he wants to indicate to the mullahs, to the so-called moderate Hassan Rouhani, who now has the pride of being the biggest per capita executor of any country in the world under his moderate regime, if he wants to send a clear signal to the Iranians, then the easiest way to do that is to invite Mrs. Rajavi to Washington. In one stroke, he will send the clearest possible message that we have changed policy entirely from our predecessor, Obama. And if he wants to impress all of us here in this room and everyone who wants to see an end to this horrific oppressive regime in Iran, then start the process by listing the IRGC as an international terrorist organization. How is it possible that the Quds Force
It's listed, yeah.
which is a subsidiary of the IRGC, has been a listed terrorist organization for years, but the IRGC gets off the hook. It runs and controls 70% of the Iranian regime's economy. List them, put them in the international terrorist blacklist, and you undermine the Iranian economy to the extent that that regime would be teetering on the edge of a cliff. We could then give it a helpful push. So that's my message to the White House. Let's hope some of our American colleagues here can take that message back. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Struan. Well, indeed, your analogy about the Soviet Union is extremely enlightening because it's true that the concept of jihadism or terrorism in the name of Islam, this kind of religious terrorism that is attacking Europe, it didn't exist as a concept before Khomeini. Because we had terrorism in Europe, yes, of course. We have had terrorism even in the 19th century. There was terrorism in the 20th century. And we had terrorism in Italy, in Germany, in Northern Ireland, in Spain. We had terrorism. But this idea of killing innocent people, people in the street just like this, in the name of Islam, I mean, religious terrorism, Islamic religious terrorism, this is something that was born when Khomeini came to power in Tehran in 1979. He was the ideological father of this. And I fully agree with Struan. It's not the first time I hear this, and we have been saying this, but it's important to insist on this idea that if, and we go back to what the ambassador said in his contribution, that if we could really topple down the Iranian regime and bring democracy and freedom and, after all, normality to Iran, all the rest of the problems will be solved with this change. And this is something that, unfortunately, people in the European capitals and in foreign ministries and in Brussels, they do not understand. Because when I go to speak to them, and Struan and we, other colleagues in the European Parliament, where we have hosted Mrs. Rajavi many times in the Parliament, when we explain this to them and ask action from them, they say, no, because you see, what we must do is to engage the regime in dialogue and support the moderates. And if we support the moderates and we engage the regime in this dialogue, then there will be a positive evolution. And this dream, this stupid dream, we have been listening for many years to this. And they are still with this mistake in their minds, Well, we will go on insisting. And the idea of Mrs. Rajavi going to Washington is very provocative because Struan is a provocateur, professional provocateur, in the good sense of the word. But it's really an excellent idea. That would terrify the regime. I mean, because apart from the material war they fight in so many places, killing so many innocent people, they also fight a psychological war against us. And if Mrs. Rajavi could go to Washington invited by the American administration, that on psychological grounds for the regime would be such a defeat that they would really suffer from it. So it's a very good idea. And to the blacklisting of the Revolutionary Guards, it's a question of logic, because if the Quds Force is listed, so you list the subsidiary, but you don't list the big corporation. I mean, it's pure nonsense. And frankly, for many of us, that we have been suffering and fighting when the Iranian resistance was unfairly and unlawfully blacklisted. I mean, to see the Revolutionary Guards blacklisted would be a wonderful feeling and an excellent compensation for what we have gone through during all these years. Okay, so thank you very much to the five of you for your excellent contributions. I think many good ideas have been said and many interesting lines of action have been suggested. Now, I think that, well, we've run out of time, but perhaps one or two questions from the floor. Yes, please.
Yeah, I think it's right that the focus should be. Yeah, my name is Karim Abdian. I am the executive director of WAS Human Rights Organization, an NGO that represents Arab Iranian in Washington, D.C. The focus on regime change is right, and there are lots of things going on today. Senator Lieberman talked about the ambassador. However, there needs to be some kind of help from the outside. And here's the question, from our perspective, the Iranian people, is that, Europeans almost useless because there is a huge engagement economically by European companies. They're all over themselves and hundreds of millions, billions of dollars investment. So they will not, like you said, sir, they will not touch that. So we're left with our friends, the Americans. We have a new president. And, things are not too bad. Currently, we have 3 insurgency, albeit in certain low level, in 3 areas of Iran. The Baluch, southeast, there's an insurgency going on daily. In our Arab areas, in Ahwaz and the Kurdish areas, there's daily clashes with the Basij and with it. But there's no mention in the media or any help. So there is a need for some sort of support. If we all say, and it's not cliche, we say this regime is terrorist, then what's wrong with helping the resistance with logistical support, intelligence support, moral support, material support? Is it not that it's taking over the Middle East? Is it affecting security, right? Stability and all that. So, and I have a question for Michael because of your background in intelligence. Are there any impediments, let's say if the new regime wants to help? I mean, there are no legal impediments that if the new administration, in fact, unlike the Obama administration, wants to help, there are no impediments, and do you see the appetite from the American people? I have one last question for Prime Minister al-Azhari, because of your background. Since Iran, by virtue of its being an imperial country, occupying Iraq and Syria and Lebanon and Yemen, can there be a wide coalition in the area? Because Iran is no longer a danger to the American people, to the Syrian peoples and Iraqi peoples and Yemenis and everything. Do you see any serious move on any level to have the the Iranian resistance, the Syrian, and perhaps Iraqis, patriots who know their country has been occupied by Iran and expand that to some kind of coalition against the Muslims?
Thank you very much. Michael, very briefly.
Very quickly, I'm glad you asked me a legal question. I'm not a lawyer, so I don't have to answer that part. All right, so that's good. So the second part is, will the U.S. do something? We're ignoring too much, like you said. We're providing airstrikes to uniformed militia in the Badr Corps, and we're ignoring too much. So I don't think there's an appetite to do this type of operation in Iran when we can't even address what's happening in front of our face in Iraq and Syria. But we're going to try, though.
Tu veux répondre à la deuxième question?
Vous savez, depuis la Deuxième Guerre mondiale, la structure sécuritaire installée au Moyen-Orient par les États-Unis d'Amérique reposait sur un certain nombre de piliers fondamentaux. Je laisse de côté la suprématie militaire d'Israël. Ça, c'est un des piliers. Le deuxième pilier, c'était la protection de toute la péninsule arabique, vis-à-vis des tentations hégémonistes régionales, c'est-à-dire principalement vis-à-vis des héritiers des Perses, les Iraniens, et les héritiers des Babyloniens, les Irakiens. Et si vous regardez cette structure, la politique étrangère des États-Unis veillait à un strict équilibre à 100% entre l'Iran et l'Irak. Et ce qu'on appelle le dual containment, c'est-à-dire chacun surveillait l'autre, ce qui fait que tant que les régimes étaient des régimes amis, ils encourageaient un surarmement égal entre les deux pays et chacun surveillait l'autre. La conséquence de la guerre de 2003 a été non seulement la rupture de cet équilibre, pire que ça, on a mis entre les mains d'un pays l'Irak. L'Irak est devenu la propriété politique du régime iranien. Et donc, vous voyez, nous sommes en présence d'une sorte de contradiction majeure qui est contraire non seulement aux intérêts de la communauté internationale, mais même aux intérêts des États-Unis d'Amérique. La situation créée actuellement en Irak, on parle de Daesh, mais l'Al-Qaïda a été créée par les États-Unis. C'est après que, dans le cadre de la lutte contre la présence soviétique, et par l'intermédiaire de l'Arabie saoudite, mais quand ils se sont aperçus que l'Al-Qaïda... Pardon?
Merci.
Pardon?
Merci pour la...
Ah, je sais pas, j'ai pas compris. Donc, c'est après quand ils se sont aperçus que Ben Laden est devenu un ennemi, que l'Al-Qaïda est devenu un ennemi des États-Unis d'Amérique. Daesh, si vous regardez la création dès la fin de l'invasion en 2003, l'Al-Qaïda a été reconstituée en Irak sous l'impulsion des États-Unis d'Amérique, sous l'impulsion de l'Iran, parce que l'Iran comptait l'utiliser pour chasser les Américains. Il est resté seul aux États-Unis d'Amérique. Ce n'est qu'après que Daesh a évolué et est devenu, disons, une coproduction dans laquelle interviennent non seulement les Iraniens, mais aussi d'autres pays de la région, notamment, vous savez, Jean de La Fontaine, qui est un grand fabuliste français du XVIIe siècle, raconte l'histoire de cette grenouille qui, voyant un bœuf, voulait devenir aussi grosse que le bœuf. Et alors, elle s'est enflée, puis elle finit par éclater. Alors, la grenouille actuellement est utilisée par l'Iran on promet à cette grenouille de remplacer l'Arabie saoudite si elle sert bien les intérêts iraniens.
Merci. Cesar, okay. So, as we have really run out of time, thank you very much, and we stop here. Thank you.
ما فهمتش مليح